There are some horror monsters who are completely timeless. Vampires have been around since the dawn of civilization itself, along with witches, ghosts, and demons. We all know why these monsters are scary, even if we don't remember what they represent. But then there are horror stories that are only scary if you've lived your life in a certain way. The Raven is about a man haunted by the possibility that he will never be reunited with his lost wife in heaven, and it's only scary to a reader who has lost someone important to him. The Black Cat is about a man who loses himself to alcoholism, and if you've never touched the bottle or only drink in moderation, the things that happen to the protagonist can never happen to you. And then there are horror stories that are a product of their times. Frankenstein is still a classic that people read today, but nobody reads the original novel to be spooked anymore. In fact, most attempts to inject horror back into the story in the movies do so by going in the exact opposite direction of the original book. Horror stories that manage to linger long after they were made are pretty rare, with Lovecraft being one of the better examples in modern history. But there's one character that's been grafted onto the Cthulhu mythos who's been slowly replaced with more and more tentacles until he became unrecognizable from his original form. Hastur, aka the King in Yellow. The King in Yellow is a story that was both a product of its time and only scary to people who had lived a life of decadence. In fact, the color yellow is often associated with decadence and was the primary color, no pun intended, of the decadent movement. The King in Yellow oddly refers to both the book of short stories by Robert W. Chambers and the fictional play mentioned in some of his stories. We get very few bits of what actually happens in the play, but while the first act isn't supposed to have any effect on its readers, anyone who reads the second act supposedly goes insane, or suffers some other horrible affliction. Historically, yellow was the color of greed, gold, mystery, and danger. Believe it or not, the association of yellow with Asia originally had nothing to do with the skin color of its people and everything to do with the Silk Road, with its potential for bringing wealth, luring many aspiring merchants to their deaths from bandits and other dangers. That, and the Chinese believed themselves to be descendants of the Gold Dragon at the time, but that's another story. So, when Robert W. Chambers published The King in Yellow in 1895, the title alone would have made people realize this was related to the decadent movement of the time. There is no way to understand the horror of the story without at least a passing understanding of the decadence. The decadent movement started out as a literary and artistic movement in France around the mid-1800s, then gradually made its way to England and the United States. A lot of the movement became closely tied to hedonism, first in art and then in real life, along with Romanticism as a direct pushback against the Enlightenment. Unfortunately, it's not an easy art movement for me to get images for this video, because even though it's art from 150 years ago, there are reasons why YouTube and even Rumble don't want some of these images on their platforms. Now, Robert W. Chambers is sometimes considered a decadent himself because he wrote in this particular time period, but despite being an author when the movement had hit the United States, he lived a rather traditional life. His works actually include quite a few criticisms of the movement. The decadent movement was largely disillusioned with the idea of truth, both in a literal sense and in the metaphorical. They were largely a result of the French Revolution, which had started because the French populace would no longer accept divine right or religion as the source of deeper meaning after generations of an oppressive nobility. They would not accept reason as the source of truth either, as put forth by Robespierre with his cult of reason during the Reign of Terror. And after Napoleon more or less showed that the only deeper truth he had to offer was good old-fashioned rule by force, the French lost a lot of their faith in good governance too. In sum, the decadents were a product of one institution after another offering a path to truth and deeper meaning, only to betray the French people and then execute some of their own loyal followers. And as a result, the only higher meaning that the decadents accepted was the sensual pleasure of the given moment. They were a rather nihilistic yet understandable result of the tragic affairs of the time. At least, before they spread out of France and into England and America, who more or less kept the hedonism part and forgot about everything else. So, with this background, we can now examine The King in Yellow with a new lens. One thing we actually know about the fictional play is that the first act is particularly decadent, at least according to characters in the short stories around the book. The last scene of the first act apparently takes place during a masquerade ball. Now, masquerade parties back then had a lot of connotations. In some contexts, they took place outside in large, open spaces, allowing both the rich and the poor to mingle together in secret. The masks could actually conceal a person's identity completely, allowing them the same level of freedom you get today on Reddit platforms. This had many great effects. People of different races and classes could party together and enjoy each other's company, even if polite society would normally refuse it. Poor people in particular could enjoy a level of free speech as well, but that was part of the problem, at least from the perspective of the rich, and especially after the French Revolution. Wealthier patrons could afford more elaborate and ornate masks, and eventually masquerades would become parties for the rich, and the original concept of mingling between class or racial lines got worn away and replaced with balls where the elites could go and engage in debauchery. This is the sort of masquerade we get a glimpse of in the last scene of Act 1 of The King in Yellow. Camilla says, "You, sir, should unmask." The stranger replies, "Indeed?" Casilda says, "Indeed, it's time. We have all laid aside disguise but you." And the stranger replies, "I wear no mask." Camilla, terrified and aside to Casilda, "No mask? No mask." There is another key detail people might be familiar with from the play that is Casilda's song, which gives us another clue about the true nature of the mysterious Yellow King. Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake, the shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies, but stranger still is lost Carcosa. Songs that the Hyades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung, as tears unshed shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. Carcosa, a name that many think is derived from Carcassonne in France, possibly a nod to the origins of the decadent movement. This song tells us several things at once. One, Carcosa isn't supposed to be on Earth. It might be on another planet, somewhere in the Hyades constellation. Although, the description of orbiting twin suns and black stars overhead suggests something else. Perhaps Carcosa isn't supposed to be on another planet, but in another dimension altogether, where black stars can be seen at night. Casilda's song describes Carcosa as lost, dim, and with a king who wears tatters. This suggests that Carcosa was a great city at some point, but it isn't anymore. If we interpret the scene of the masquerade as taking place in Carcosa, then the first act may be showing the city right before the fall. So we can deduce that there's some sort of decadence in Carcosa. The king is described as being in tatters, and it's supposed to be scary when the stranger, who is implied to be the king in yellow, says that he's not wearing a mask. There's one more piece of this puzzle we need to look at from Robert's book, specifically from the short story In the Court of the Dragon, where a man is pursued by a church organist who is either death itself or the avatar of the king in yellow. When the man is caught and dies, he wakes up in the ruins of Carcosa, where he is confronted by the king in yellow himself. And this is the only time we get to hear the mysterious king actually say anything that isn't a line in the play. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. A curious thing for the king in yellow to say, considering it's a direct quote from Hebrews 10 verse 31. So in this particular case, we might say that the Yellow King is talking about the Abrahamic God, or maybe something along those lines. That's a particularly noteworthy thing when the main literature movement of the time was rebelling against the idea of God and religion in general, but in particular against Big G. This story strongly suggests that the protagonist is being punished, or at least facing the consequences of his actions. And to that end, there's one more clue we need to look at, and unlike the rest of our stories so far, this one wasn't written by Robert Chambers. An Inhabitant of Carcosa is a story written by Ambrose Bierce, a writer from San Francisco back when the streets weren't full of literal poo, published in 1886, 9 years before Robert Chambers published The King in Yellow. The story is largely thought to have inspired Chambers, as it's the first place where we see the city of Carcosa mentioned. Now, this poem itself might have been inspired by Gustave Naudad's poem Carcassonne, a poem about a man's failed attempt to reach the beautiful city before his death. In Bierce's poem, a man wakes up in an unfamiliar wilderness, unaware of how he got there. The last thing he remembers was being sick in bed. Although he encounters several strange things, including an owl, a lynx, and a guy dressed in only skins, they don't react to him, as if they can neither see, hear, or smell him in the case of the predator. He looks up and can see through the clouds at the stars of Hyades and Aldebaran, which tell him that, despite having no difficulty seeing and being outside with no artificial lights, it must be nighttime. He then finds a graveyard, with many tombstones detailing dates of birth and death. Finally, to his horror, he finds a grave with his name, date of birth, and the date of his death. Our protagonist is dead, and is amidst the ruins of the famous city, Carcosa. While there is a lot of symbolism to unpack and many different interpretations exist, this story depicts Carcosa as being somewhere on Earth, judging by the stars that are visible in the sky. Unlike the theatrical play, the man is looking up at the sky and seeing the stars Hyades and Aldebaran, rather than being on a planet orbiting one of those stars or existing somewhere in their constellations. We also learn that Carcosa, in this depiction, is a place where a man can go when he dies, and is not affected by the normal rules of life, such as needing light to see or being bothered by the weather. And the afterlife he has reached is one that's in ruins, having completely collapsed. Unlike the protagonist of Carcassonne, this man reached the fabled beautiful city in death, only to find it in ruins. Imagine if you were to die and wake up not in hell, but in heaven, only to find the place completely destroyed. Instead of perdition, where you find yourself suffering because you failed to meet whatever standards you were supposed to meet to reach paradise, you find yourself in the good place, only to find that place is in ruins. The king of this place might be God, or he might be a pretender, or he has simply become the blank, vacant mask that he wears until it is no longer a mask. This is the fate of the decadents, those who believe there is no higher truth. They got what they expected. Instead of heaven, there is only decay. The king? He is dressed in yellow tatters. Perhaps this is a reflection of how decadence can cause a civilization to fall apart, as was the case for the Roman Empire, or some of the ancient Greeks, or even the original Carcassonne, although that last one is up for debate. The king in yellow is not God, or the demiurge, or some alien deity with tentacles everywhere. Instead, he's the corpse of a god, or perhaps of art and higher truth. In trying to create art with no higher meaning, the decadents became the mask. These empty, hollow paintings and plays with no deeper meanings were now the decadents' personalities. Empty, meaningless, ruined. One thing that strikes me is that, in order for a person to be driven mad by the fictional play of The King in Yellow, they have to first read Act 1, which is described as decadent but not capable of driving you mad, and then read Act 2, which is where the madness sets in. I believe that this is because Act 1 is so filled with repulsive imagery of decadence and debauchery, anyone who isn't interested in that sort of thing will put the play down, uninterested in Act 2. People who enjoy that sort of decadence enough to keep reading are the ones who are struck with madness, and I suspect it has something to do with the kind of person you have to be to keep reading. Other decadent works from this time period include Salome, a play about the attempted seduction of John the Baptist and his eventual beheading, which ends with the titular character caressing his severed head and kissing it on the lips. And who could forget the picture of Dorian Gray, by the same author as Salome, a novel packed with acts of depravity where the protagonist is ultimately only defeated by his own conscience. And one interpretation is that Dorian would have been fine if he simply hadn't turned his back on the bohemian lifestyle of the decadent movement. This is the sort of stuff that the decadents were into. There was no higher meaning or message where Salome or her father Herod get some sort of comeuppance, no ties to the rest of the biblical stories the play is based on, just sex and gore, and, in Dorian's case, drugs. Knowing this, if Act 1 is considered decadent by the standards of the time, it makes sense that most people wouldn't want to read Act 2. What if a person who wasn't part of the decadent movement read Act 2 and it had no effect on them at all? Perhaps the people who don't want to read Oscar Wilde aren't bothered by the ending of the play. And I think that that is why for most people, The King in Yellow isn't scary today, any more than The Raven or Frankenstein. This kind of horror isn't quite as dated as The Embodiment of the Plague we were trying to escape from showed up at our rich people party, or the dashing white protagonist discovers that he is actually part Jew. But it's easy to see why most people today don't see anything of value in the original version of this character. No wonder people who like to include him in the Cthulhu mythos have turned him into an incomprehensible tentacle deity named Hastur. But perhaps there's still an opportunity for fear here. After all, if the King in Yellow represents the death of gods and higher meanings, and the hollowing out of your own personality, surely there are other ways to rekindle the horror. In this modern age, where many people seem to have no moral foundation, who live entirely in the moment as if nothing but hedonism mattered, the King in Yellow offers us something other than eternal damnation as a deterrent. Instead of being punished by a god they don't believe in, the decadents are effectively punished by themselves, punished for their hollowness with a life devoid of meaning. And from a religious perspective, maybe that's the truth behind the verse. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.